Hey guys, and thanks for tuning in. Tonight we dive nose first into the not-so-fresh world of hygiene in the Wild West. But before we begin, if you enjoy this story, please consider giving this video a like and a subscribe. And without further ado, find your comfy spot and saddle up. It's about to get stinky. The Wild West, a land of cowboys, outlaws, saloons, and shoutouts. But beneath the rugged charm of six-shooters and spurred boots lies a side of frontier life that rarely gets talked about: hygiene. Have you ever wondered how people kept clean while chasing cattle or robbing stagecoaches? What did a bath mean when water was so scarce and soap was a luxury? All right, let's set the stage. It's the late 1800s. You're in a dusty frontier town, and after riding a horse for 10 hours in the sun, you're sweaty, sore, and probably smell like a mix of leather, smoke, and regret. So, what do? Time to take a bath, right? Well, not so fast. In the Wild West, water was about as rare as a polite outlaw, and if you wanted to take a bath, you better be ready to pay up, or lower your standards. Much of the West is dry. We're talking deserts, scrubland, and towns built miles from rivers. Rain? Rare. Wells? Hard to dig. And if you found water, that was for drinking, cooking, and your horses, not for making yourself smell like a bouquet of roses. Put it this way, if you had enough water to fill a bathtub, you were either rich or hallucinating. If you wanted a real bath, you went to a bathhouse or a salon that offered them. You'd get a metal tub, a bucket of hot-ish water, and if you were lucky, a bar of soap. Sounds decent, right? Well, here's the catch. That water was reused over and over again. You were sharing your bath with every stranger who got in it before you. Baths usually cost around 25 to 50 cents, and at that time, that was a lot. That's like paying $15 to $20 today for a lukewarm bath and someone else's leftover bath water. And if you wanted your own water, well, you guessed it, that'd be more money. A fresh towel? Extra. Soap? Hope you brought your own. Soap existed, but it wasn't gentle. Most people made it themselves by boiling animal fat and wood ash into a rough, caustic bar that would strip paint off a wagon. Towels? Not guaranteed. You might get a communal rag if you were lucky. Most people used their own clothes. Others just stood around dripping, hoping the wind would finish off the job. So yeah, taking a bath in the Wild West wasn't exactly relaxing. It was expensive, awkward, and actually kind of horrifying. Let's say you survived your lukewarm communal bath. Congrats. You're clean for about 30 seconds. Because now you're putting back on the same clothes you've been wearing for days, maybe even weeks. Welcome to the next layer of grime, laundry in the Wild West. Back then, clothing wasn't just dirty, it was deeply dirty. We're talking trail dust, sweat, mud, horsehair, bacon grease, and whatever the outhouse situation left behind. So how often did people wash their clothes? The short answer is not often. The long answer is not very often. Most folks had only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, and clothes were repaired, reworn, and layered until they were functionally fused to your body. Laundry day happened maybe once a week if you had the time, water, and the soap. So laundry day rolls around. So how are you washing your clothes? You had no washers, no dryers, just elbow grease. Clothes were washed using a washboard, a bucket, and homemade soap. If you were lucky, you had access to a creek or a well. Soaking and scrubbing took hours, Then clothes were wrung out by hand and hung to dry, usually outside on lines, fences, or bushes. So who was doing all of this laundry, you might be wondering? Like many unpleasant chores in the Wild West, laundry was usually done by women, wives, mothers, or hired laundresses. In mining and railroad towns, Chinese immigrant laundries were common, often the only place to get professionally cleaned clothes. They charged by the piece and were essential in frontier towns where few had the time or space to do the laundry themselves. Oh, and in case you are wondering what's going on underneath the layers, well, most wore long underwear or union suits, one piece of wool or cotton outfits. They were rarely washed, especially in the winter, and were often worn for months without being changed. Washing clothes in the frontier took time and effort and a whole lot of scrubbing. But staying clean didn't stop you at what you wore. When nature called, there was no indoor plumbing, no flushing, and no privacy like we know it as today. Let's talk about outhouses, the not-so-glamorous side of frontier hygiene. Most frontier homes didn't have indoor plumbing. Instead, they used outhouses, small wooden buildings built over a deep pit in the ground. A basic bench with a hole served as a toilet, no flush, no water, just gravity. If you were lucky, the door had a moon cut into it for light and ventilation. If you were really lucky, it stayed standing during a windstorm. Outhouses were necessary, but they weren't sanitary by modern standards. No running water meant no hand washing, unless a separate wash basin was nearby. Flies and insects were constant and could carry bacteria to food or living areas. Contamination of groundwater was a real danger if outhouses were placed too close to wells or water sources, and waste pits could overflow or collapse if not dug deep enough or emptied out in time. If proper distance and upkeep weren't followed, an outhouse could quickly turn into a health hazard. Toilet paper wasn't widely available until the late 1800s, and even then, it was a luxury. Most folks used whatever they had on hand, like leaves, corn cobs, moss or grass, sometimes newspapers, catalogs, or pages from books. But what else was lurking in an outhouse? Well, outhouses weren't just smelly, they were actually really dangerous. Snakes, spiders, and rodents sometimes made their way into the pits. In winter, outhouses were freezing cold, and in the summer, sweltering and buzzing with flies. Night visits, often done with a lantern in one hand and a club in the other, just in case. No matter the season, using the outhouse was more of an ordeal than a relief. Sanitation was a major challenge of the frontier. Outhouses helped keep waste out of homes, but diseases still spread, especially in towns and camps where people lived close together. Typhoid fever, dysentery, and cholera were common in areas with poor waste management. Proper placement and construction of outhouses was absolutely critical, but it wasn't always practiced. Hygiene awareness was limited, and people didn't yet understand the role of bacteria in diseases. In short, outhouses were better than nothing, but not by much. Using the bathroom in the Wild West wasn't convenient, comfortable, or especially clean, but it was a part of their daily life. Outhouses were simple solutions to a complex problem: how to live without plumbing and still try to stay healthy. All right, so now we've talked about baths, outhouses, and laundry. But what about something else we deal with every single day? Brushing our teeth? In the Wild West, oral hygiene was, let's say, a work in progress. Toothbrushes did exist in the 19th century, but most people on the frontier, they didn't have one. Manufactured brushes with bone handles and boar hair bristles were available, but they were expensive and hard to come by, especially in remote towns. So many people clean their teeth using cloths, twigs, or whittled sticks known as chew sticks. These would be rubbed on the teeth and gums to remove debris, sometimes with salt or baking soda. It wasn't perfect, but it helped keep plaque and food buildup under control, at least somewhat. Toothpaste, as we know it today, didn't really exist out west. People used a variety of homemade mixtures to clean their teeth, things like crushed charcoal, salt, baking soda, powdered chalk, and even wood ash. These abrasive powders worked to scrub the teeth clean, but they could also damage enamel over time. With limited dental care and sugary, processed foods becoming more common by the late 1800s, tooth decay became a real issue, especially among settlers who had access to flour, sugar, and alcohol. There were no fluoride treatments or regular dental checkups, and cavities were common. Toothaches were a part of life for many. If a tooth went bad, the solution was usually simple: just pull it. And if you're wondering who did the pulling, sometimes a dentist, but often a barber or general doctor with a strong grip and questionable training. Traveling dentists set up shop in saloons or rented rooms. Some were trained, others not so much. Basic procedures included tooth extractions, filling cavities with metal, and occasionally false teeth. Dental tools were rudimentary, sterilization was rare, and pain relief was limited, usually just whiskey or biting down on leather. Needless to say, people didn't go to the dentist until they absolutely had to. Oral hygiene in the Wild West was simple, improvised, and often painful. People did what they could with what they had, but tooth problems were common and solutions were crude. If you managed to keep your teeth well into old age, you were lucky, or just really careful. All right, well, now we've talked about baths, laundry, and even oral hygiene. But there's one part to frontier life that followed you everywhere, whether you liked it or not: body odor. It's not the most glamorous topic, but on the frontier, body odor wasn't just common, it was expected. Body odor was so common due to the lack of facilities. Water was scarce, soap was harsh, and hard labor meant you were sweating through your clothes on a daily basis. People wore heavy fabrics like wool and canvas, often layered and rarely washed. And with the lack of air conditioning, long days outdoors, and limited access to clean water, it all made staying fresh nearly impossible. But just because daily bathing wasn't the norm didn't mean people didn't care about how they smelled. They just had to get really creative. People used herbs like mint, sage, or lavender rubbed on the skin or placed in clothing. Homemade colognes, or toilet waters, were made from alcohol, essential oils, and herbs. Women sometimes carried handkerchiefs scented with perfume to hold over their noses in crowded areas. Commercial deodorant didn't really exist until the late 1880s, and antiperspirants came even later, around 1903. So in the Wild West, you just made do. Some people used baking soda or vinegar to try and reduce the odor. Others focused on covering the smell with perfumes or strong soap rather than preventing it. But let's be honest, most people just lived with it. In a world where everyone smelled a little ripe, it was actually not that big of a deal. So we've covered dirt, sweat, and body odor. But now it's time to talk about the real enemies of hygiene in the Wild West: lice and fleas. And trust me, they were everywhere. In frontier towns, on homesteads, or out on cattle drives, personal cleanliness was hard to maintain, and that made people really easy targets for pests. Head lice, body lice, and fleas were incredibly common. People slept in shared beds, wore unclean clothing, and lived close to livestock. All ideal conditions for infestations. Mattresses were often stuffed with straw or animal hair, which could harbor bugs if not regularly replaced. And spoiler alert, they often weren't. They didn't have bug spray or anti-lice shampoo, so people turned to some pretty extreme measures. Shaving heads was a common response to head lice, especially for children or soldiers. Washing hair with vinegar, kerosene, or coal oil was sometimes done to kill lice, though it was dangerous and harsh on your skin. For body lice and fleas, people boiled their clothes only if they could, beat blankets and bedding, and used combs or nitpicking tools to remove eggs. Even with limited resources, people still took pride in their appearance, or at least they tried to. Grooming tools were basic, but essential. Combs were often made of wood, bone, or horn. Straight razors were used for shaving, sometimes daily, often less depending on water access. Hairbrushes, tweezers, and scissors were kept in basic grooming kits, especially by travelers or soldiers. In barbershops, they served as important community hubs for shaves, haircuts, and sometimes even delousing treatments. It wasn't about luxury. It was about keeping manageable and trying to avoid worse problems down the line. When we picture the women of the Wild West, we often imagine them in bonnets or prairie dresses, tough, practical, and sunburned. But what about makeup? Did frontier women glam up? Well, some did. But it wasn't exactly considered proper. In the 1800s, especially in rural America, makeup carried a stigma. Wearing too much could be seen as vain, improper, or even immoral. Respectable women were expected to appear natural, modest, and unadorned. Heavy makeup, well, it was associated with actresses, saloon girls, or prostitutes. Even blush or lip color could be scandalous if it looked too artificial. So women who did use makeup, they usually did it very discreetly, just enough to look healthier, but not overly polished. Makeup was often homemade, using simple ingredients, or purchased from traveling salesmen, catalogs, or general stores. Blush was made from beet juice, berry juice, or crushed petals. Lip color from tinted waxes or natural dyes. Face powder was made from rice flour, cornstarch, or even lead-based compounds, which were incredibly dangerous but surprisingly common. Eyebrow darkener used soot or burned matchsticks, and Vaseline or animal fat for shine or skin protection. Makeup wasn't just for vanity. For some, it was for protection. Women used powders and creams to guard against sunburn, windburn, and dryness, especially in the dry and dusty plains. Lip balm made from beeswax or lard was super common. Some used buttermilk or egg whites as skin treatments, or to give that pale, refined appearance. And scented oils or floral water helped with both body odor and skincare. In a world of dust storms, wood stoves, and wind-chapped skin, a little self-care wasn't just about beauty. It was about comfort. So like I mentioned, not all women wore makeup, and many never did. But you'd be more likely to find it among wealthier women in established towns, entertainers, actresses, and saloon performers. Young, unmarried women hoping to appear more attractive to suitors, and brothel workers who used it more boldly and commercially. And even among them, it was applied with a light hand, not the dramatic looks we see today. So yes, women in the Wild West did wear makeup. A touch of rouge or scented oil offered a bit of beauty and comfort in a rough world. But out here, survival often mattered more than appearance, especially when illness or injury came knocking. Let's take a look at what passed for medical care in the Wild West and why getting sick could be more dangerous than a gunfight. So you've made it through a cattle drive, a dust storm, and maybe even a bar fight. But now you've got a bullet in your leg, a toothache, or worse, a fever. Who do you call? In the Wild West, medicine was more guesswork than science. Medical care on the frontier varied widely. Some towns had trained doctors, others had none at all. And even the best physicians were working with limited tools, little knowledge of germs, and almost no anesthesia. Many doctors were self-taught or learned on the job. Medical licensing was rare before the 1880s, especially out west. And people relied heavily on folk remedies, home cures, and herbal treatments passed down through families or local communities. So what was in the average frontier medical kit? A mix of hope, painkillers, and a little bit of danger. Whiskey was used for cleaning wounds, dulling pain, and calming nerves. Mercury and castor oil, all used to treat various ailments. And bleeding and blistering were still common treatments in the early to mid-1800s. Some of these helped. Others made things worse. A lot worse. Surgery was a last resort, but sometimes it was the only option. Amputations were common, especially after gunshot wounds or infections. There were no antibiotics, so even a small cut could turn deadly. And tools weren't always sterilized. An infection was a major killer. Patients were given whiskey, bitten down on a leather, and hoped the surgeon worked fast. And he had to. Many procedures had to be done in under 5 minutes. When no doctor was available, which was often, people turned to what they had. Herbal medicine played a major role. Willow bark for pain, peppermint for nausea, yarrow for wounds. Indigenous knowledge was sometimes adopted by settlers, though often misunderstood or misused. And women, especially midwives and caretakers, often became the de facto health providers in their homes and in their communities. For most people, healing came from your neighbors, not a hospital. Frontier medicine was community-driven as much as it was chaotic. But the truth of reality, even minor illnesses could be deadly. Infections, pneumonia, childbirth complications, tuberculosis, and typhoid were all common. And with no vaccines and limited sanitation, epidemics spread fast in towns and mining camps, and life expectancy was short, especially for women and children. Getting sick on the frontier wasn't just inconvenient. It was a real gamble, and a lot of people didn't survive it. Frontier medicine was a blend of bravery, improvisation, and desperation. Some doctors were true heroes, others just hopeful amateurs. But every splint, every stitch, and every dose tells the same story. People trying their best to survive a world that didn't give them many chances. Medical care on the frontier was often a mix of skill, superstition, and sheer luck. But when the town doctor wasn't around or didn't exist, people turned to someone else entirely. He might cut your hair, trim your beard, and pull your tooth, all in one visit. Let's step into the barber shop, one of the West's most unlikely places for healthcare. Today, a trip to the barber shop means a fresh cut, maybe a beard trim, and some light conversation. But in the Wild West, barbershops were a whole different experience. Part grooming parlor, part surgical theater, and sometimes a place to get your teeth pulled. On the frontier, the barbershop was often the cleanest and most professional-looking building in town. Men came in for haircuts and straight razor shaves, but also for so much more. Bloodletting, tooth extractions, minor surgeries, lancing boils, and cupping and leeching. Oh, and the red and white barber pole, that actually comes from the days when barbers performed bloodletting. The red for blood, the white for bandages. You weren't just groomed, you were gambling with frontier medicine. Despite the risk, grooming mattered to many Western men. A regular shave or trim helped maintain a sense of dignity, especially for those living hard, dirty lives on cattle drives, in mining camps, or on the frontier. Beards and mustaches were often carefully styled. Pomades and oils were used when available, and some barbers even offered shoe shining, cologne, or scalp treatments. Looking sharp wasn't just vanity. It was a part of holding on to civilization in a place that often felt like the edge of it. Barbershops were also community centers. They were places to hear the latest gossip, read a newspaper, and talk politics, cattle prices, or the latest shootout. And for many men, the barber shop was one of the only indoor spaces in town where you could sit, relax, and be taken care of for just a few minutes. So while the barber shop may have started with a haircut and a shave, it could easily end with stitches, an extracted tooth, or a medical procedure you probably didn't want. But in a world where doctors were rare and pain was constant, the barber was one of the most important people in town. From makeshift bathtubs to barbers doubling as surgeons, hygiene in the Wild West was raw, rugged, and often downright risky. But in a world without modern plumbing, antibiotics, or even reliable soap, people did what they could to stay clean, or at least cleaner than the guy next to them. It wasn't pretty, but it was survival. Now, staying clean in the Wild West was, let's say, a challenge, but life wasn't all grit and grime. People still found ways to kick back, have fun, and maybe even forget about the smell for a while. So let's dust off our boots and take a look at how folks in the Wild West spent their free time. Before Netflix, before DVDs, before even those black and white silent films, there were live picture shows. Essentially traveling performances that combined projected still images with dramatic narration, sound effects, and maybe a banjo if you were lucky. Imagine a PowerPoint presentation, but with way more whiskey and occasional gunfire. People would cram into makeshift theaters or town halls, squint at grainy projections, and gasp at exotic scenes from far-off lands. Or maybe just from the next county over. In the Wild West, a picture show was a rare ticket to the wider world, even if the projector jammed halfway through and melted the slide of Paris into something resembling a fried egg. Another popular activity was going to saloons. At the time, the saloon wasn't just for drinking, though drinking was definitely the main event. It was the social hub of a Wild West town. Need to find a card game? A dance partner? A brawl? Maybe all three at once? The saloon was your one-stop shop. Drinks ranged from whiskey that could strip paint off a barn to beer that tasted vaguely like regret. Entertainment could include live music, gambling tables, and the occasional piano player who doubled as a bouncer. Saloons were where news spread, alliances formed, and reputations either grew or, well, got shot. As grim as it sounds today, Public hangings in the Wild West were events. Whole towns would turn out, families, kids, dogs. Not because they were bloodthirsty monsters, but because it was one of the few times something exciting actually happened. In an era without television or sports leagues, this was disturbingly live entertainment. Vendors would sometimes sell snacks, and folks treated it like a social gathering, catching up on gossip while waiting for the grim finale. It's a dark reminder that family-friendly fun used to be a lot more questionable. Brothels in the Wild West were as common as general stores, and sometimes better maintained. They were often called parlors, or houses of ill repute, but the reality was straightforward. These establishments weren't just about adult entertainment. They also served as informal salons where news, music, and gossip flowed. Many madams were savvy businesswomen who kept their operations cleaner and better furnished than the saloons. And while the clientele varied from lonely cowhands to traveling businessmen, one thing was certain: nobody came in for the coffee. Gambling was also a popular activity that people engaged in the Wild West. If you had money, or even if you didn't, there was always a game of chance waiting. Poker, blackjack, dice. You could gamble on cards, horse races, even how long it would take for a dust storm to roll in. The stakes could range from a few coins to a horse, a piece of land, or your best hat, which in the Wild West was almost as valuable as land. The atmosphere was a mix of excitement, tension, and the occasional flying chair when someone accused the dealer of cheating, which, to be fair, was often true. When a traveling circus came into town, it was like Christmas. The 4th of July and payday rolled into one. These shows brought exotic animals, most of which looked deeply confused about the prairie, daring acrobats, clowns that were equally funny and terrifying, and sometimes curiosities that ranged from the mildly interesting to ethically questionable. For many frontier towns, the circus was the only time people got to see trained elephants, sword swallowers, or a man claiming to be part fish. Everyone turned out dressed in their best, which usually meant slightly less dusty. Thanks for riding along through one of the grittier corners of frontier life. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories from the untamed West, and let me know in the comments, what surprised you the most about hygiene back then? Until next time, stay curious, stay clean, and maybe be grateful for indoor plumbing. Alright, that's it for this video. Bye guys, and I'll see you in the morning. And for those of you still up, I'll tend to the fire a little bit longer, hoping the sounds of the crackling fire will put you to sleep. Bye.